Chapter 9. The Market of Small Wonders. Morning came in with a soft sea breath that slipped through curtains and laid a cool hand on Aiden's cheek, and he woke with the steady comfort that had followed him since the night they hung candles on the old clock tower, as if a quiet ring of light still rested around his heart and kept time without ticking. He sat up slowly and looked at the small glass where the cutting drifted on the sill, its forked root a pale ribbon in clear water, and he whispered a simple greeting as if the plant were a housemate who rose early and liked gentle company. On the table the sketchbook waited with a few grains of sand still caught in the binding from the dune path 2 nights ago, and the sand made a small soft sound when he lifted the book, the sound of memory choosing to stay. He brewed tea and watched steam curl toward the ceiling in thin lines that looked like pencil marks in the air, then wrote a short note on a card for the cafe board that said "Thank you for the help last night. The jars at the tower still glow in the mind. Neighbors are stars when wires sleep." He ate simple toast and a slice of peach, and while he ate he thought about the weekend market that would stretch along the square from the fountain to the lane by the bookshop, and he smiled at the thought of warm baskets and voices that rose and fell like small waves and the slow, careful pace of people who came to look for a treat, a keepsake, or a friendly chat. He had promised Mira that they would walk the market together after breakfast, not to buy much, only to enjoy the sight of things made by steady hands, and perhaps to find one object they would carry as a quiet sign of what they had begun to build since the first hello under lamplight. The bell above the cafe door lifted its clear note when he entered, and the owner looked up with the kind of smile that makes a person feel like the day is a room already warmed. He pinned his card to the board beside a pressed leaf that Mira had placed before dawn, and he read her line under it, which said, "Every small flame finds a home when many hands open at once," and a tiny drawing of the tower face shone at the corner of her note. He held the image in his mind and ordered chamomile with honey while the kettle breathed. The fern by the window held beads of water from a morning mist, and each bead caught a small circle of light from the candle on the sill as if the room had sprinkled the plant with tiny moons. Mira arrived with a canvas bag and soft steps, and she wore a sweater the color of weathered driftwood with a ribbon near the wrist that looked like a narrow piece of sky. They sat for a moment with their cups and spoke in the easy way of people who had done good work together and trusted the silence between words. She asked about the cutting, and he told her it had sent another thin root in the night, and she nodded as if she had expected the courage, then said the greenhouse held a steady calm after the outage, and that the lantern frame waited on the table beneath a cloth like a small boat on a still dock, and that she had written a letter to thank the neighbor who had placed a lantern in his upstairs window when the streets went dark. They finished their tea and stepped into the square where the market had found its shape. Stalls lined both sides of the walk, and a string of small paper lanterns crossed overhead even though the sun was up, because color has a right to be present at all times. Children held pastries wrapped in paper and moved with the pleased focus of people who know they have earned a treat by waking early with cheerful hearts. The fountain splashed with a sound that made even strangers turn their shoulders from the day's wait. Aiden and Mira walked slowly and let the market tell them what to see first. A table of handmade wooden toys drew them near. A small boat with a tiny mast rested on a cloth sea, and a man with careful hands explained that the boat could float in a bowl but was just as happy on a windowsill. Aiden touched the smooth hull and thought about how many hours of gentle shaping had gone into a curve that felt as if it had grown from water rather than from wood. Mira smiled at the little oar and said the boat might like a name someday, and the man nodded as if he had waited years for someone to say that. They moved on to a stall where a woman sold spices in jars with handwritten labels. The air around the stall was warmer than the square because cinnamon and cardamom and clove made a nest for a nose to rest in. The woman lifted the lid of a jar of saffron and let them look at the threads that glowed like a captured sunset. She said only a little could carry the idea of warmth through an entire pot. Mira bought a jar of cinnamon sticks to place near the greenhouse kettle for afternoons when visitors needed a longer breath, and Aiden chose a small tin of tea leaves that smelled like the space between rain and sunlight. He tucked the tin into his pocket and decided to open it later when he needed to remember this morning. A row of stalls offered pottery that seemed to hold the sea in its glaze. Bowls looked like tide pools with pale rims. Cups looked like shells turned inside out. Aiden lifted a shallow dish that had a line of tiny bubbles under the surface, and the potter smiled and said the bubbles were a gift from the kiln, proof that even fire liked to leave small stories. Mira bought a simple cup for the greenhouse shelf, not because she needed another cup, but because the cup felt like the sort of friend a person is glad to see even when there is no news. They paused by a table covered in old books and maps, and Aiden ran a finger along the spines without taking any home, the way a person greets a room of acquaintances before slipping out the door to do quiet work. At a corner near the Clocktower steps, a musician played a calm tune on a violin that did not show off. The melody fell like leaves on water, each note landing and then letting go. People slowed their feet without looking down, as if the music had politely taken their wrists and shown them how to rest. A pair of students sold small paintings of the harbor, and Aiden admired the way one had painted the morning light as a circle of pale gold that did not need any rays to be understood. He and Mira shared a pastry that flaked apart over a napkin and tasted like butter, and sugar had learned to speak kindly to each other without shouting. They thanked the baker, who said this was the first batch of the season with fruit from a neighbor's tree, and that the early harvest always tasted like a hopeful letter. The market widened near the fountain, and here they found the table that would later feel like the heart of the day, a stall with lanterns in many simple shapes. The maker was an older woman with a braid so long it looked like a cord, and she spoke to each person as if choosing a lantern were the same as choosing a companion. On the table stood lanterns of wood and glass, of metal with cut patterns, of paper on delicate frames, and each one seemed to cast its own light even though none of them were lit. Some were tall and thin like candelabras, Some were short and wide like steady afternoons. One stood apart, and that one held both of their eyes at once. It was small enough to carry with one hand and strong enough to live on a table in a wind. The frame was a pale wood that looked like it had been sanded by a patient river, and each side held glass in soft white and green with a single square of blue set at the center of one face. The blue was not as deep as their rare sea glass find, but it held a calm that tugged at memory. The maker saw the way they looked at that lantern and smiled the smile of someone who knows when an object has found its people. She told them she had made it a month ago and had not sold it because she was waiting for two sets of hands that worked well together to come and claim it. Mira asked how she chose the colors, and the woman said she liked to leave room for light to speak, that if glass grew too busy it forgot to listen to a flame. Aiden lifted the lantern and turned it in his hands and felt the gentle weight, not heavy, not fragile, the feeling of something meant to be used. He remembered the jars on the clock tower and the way the town had looked like a sky pulled down and set on rooftops, and he felt a quiet certainty that this lantern could be a keepsake that held that night without trying to trap it. He looked at Mira and saw the same thought in her face, and they did not need more talk. They pulled their coins and added a little more than the price without saying why, and the maker nodded and wrapped the lantern in soft paper as if it were a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. She said a lantern asks only for care and honesty, and that it returns both in light. They carried the wrapped bundle between them like friends sharing a story, and they both felt the odd happiness that fills the chest when two people choose the same symbol without hurry. They crossed to a stall of herbs and dipped their heads to smell rosemary and mint and a small pot of thyme that looked as if it were telling a joke only the soil could hear. Mira bought a tiny bundle of lavender for the greenhouse door, and the vendor tied it with twine and slipped a sprig of lemon balm beside it with a wink that said this house will smell like a good memory. Aiden found a table of handmade paper goods and purchased 2 blank cards with deckled edges and a sheet of thin paper pressed with light petals. And he thought of all the notes they had left on the cafe board and how this paper might invite a slower hand and kinder words when the next message asked for it. They sat by the fountain and watched the market move like a river that knew how to bend without breaking. Aiden sketched the scene with loose lines while Mira counted the stalls and told him which ones often stood in different places depending on the season. She showed him where the spice stall liked to be when the wind turned off the sea, and where the toy maker set his table in autumn when the sun leaned more kindly behind the buildings. He drew a little map of her voice in the margin and marked it with the names she used so the market would feel like a living town inside his sketchbook, not just a set of stalls. The day thickened into a warm afternoon that did not press too hard. They shared a cup of iced tea with a slice of lemon that looked like a coin lost in a deep pocket. And then they rose and wandered toward the lane that led to the bookshop, passing a row of stalls that sold little things that do not need to exist and yet make a day better because they do. A small dish made of shell shards drew Myra's attention, and she set it back gently because she did not need it but wanted to let her eyes thank it. Aiden lifted a pocket mirror with a wooden back carved with a fern and put it back because he already had the mirror in his room and did not wish to make mirrors compete. They laughed at themselves for being careful with small objects and agreed that care was not only for large matters. Near the lane they saw a sign for a table where people could write a wish for the town and tuck it into a jar to be read at the end of the season by the council that gathered beneath the church bell. They stood for a minute among the jars. Some held wishes as simple as more benches, please, and others asked for a light at the corner where the steps were tricky. And one asked for a late ferry on warm evenings so grandparents could hear music without rushing home. Aiden and Mira each wrote a wish. He wrote that the town remember how good it felt to place light for one another. And she wrote that the greenhouse be a room where tired hearts could sit with plants and feel like guests who were already welcome. They slipped their wishes into the jar and walked on. The afternoon lengthened and shadows grew friendly. They returned to the lantern stall to thank the maker again and to tell her how it had felt to carry the wrapped light through the lanes. She was speaking to a child who could not decide between a paper lantern painted with stars and a wooden one with a little door. And she held both while the child thought, and the patient sight made Aiden feel simple joy. They found a quiet bench near the clocktower stairs and unwrapped the lantern to let it breathe. The sun leaned on the glass and the green looked like leaves held to the sky, the white looked like a sail, and the square of blue made a small calm pool at the center that asked for nothing. Aiden set his sketchbook on his knee and drew the lantern with Myra's hand near the frame. Not in full, only fingers at the edge, because hands that carry a symbol are part of the symbol. They spoke about where the lantern might live. He suggested his windowsill, but she reminded him that the cutting already claimed that spot and that the glass would prefer a place where many eyes might see it. She suggested the cafe shelf near the board, and he considered the way the fern light reached that shelf at certain hours and said that might be the right home for a while, especially if the owner did not mind keeping a careful watch and lighting it on evenings when neighbors needed kindness more than usual. They agreed to ask, and they wrapped the lantern again with the same care the maker had used. To honor the day, they walked to the pier and let the salt air clean their thoughts the way tide cleans rock. And they stood side by side with their elbows on the rail like children who had learned the shape of a good rest. He spoke about the lantern they were building for the greenhouse and how this market lantern could guide their choices. He said the market lantern reminded him to leave space for light to be itself. She said the market lantern reminded her to let blue be true and not to smother it with decoration. They smiled at how their thoughts met and made one thought. When they returned to the square, the music had changed to a soft tune with piano and a simple drum, and the market had begun to loosen its edges as people carried small bags home and stall holders wrapped their tables in cloth. They stopped at the cafe to ask about the lantern, and the owner clapped her hands once in quiet pleasure and said the shelf had been waiting for such a guest, and that she would treat it like a good friend who should never feel alone. She promised to light it with a safe candle on evenings when the room held a hush and to place beside it a small card that said "Light Found Together." which would be the lantern's name, and she smiled at the way their shoulders dropped when they heard their own idea given back as an offer. They left the lantern in her care and stood for a moment by the board while Aiden pinned a card with a simple drawing of two hands holding flame and a line that said, "Thank you for learning how to shine in company." And Mira added a narrow slip pressed with a sprig of lavender and 3 small seeds taped at the corner. They did not need more words. The board seemed to breathe in the new notes and become itself again. The rest of the afternoon passed with the quiet tasks that make a life useful and soft. They returned to the greenhouse to check the frame and to lay the sea glass pieces on the cloth once more to see if the day had changed their plan. They decided to place the pale aqua with the tiny bubble near the top so that daylight could find the bubble and make it glow like a held breath. They left the white heart at the bottom and tested a gentle swing to be sure no piece would tap too loudly when the night breeze turned a corner. They drank tea with a cinnamon stick resting against the cup, and the smell made the room feel like a library in winter even though summer held the hill. They spoke quietly about future market days and about how they might one day have a small stall together with prints of drawings and cuttings that had rooted and little cards with pressed leaves and lines for kind sleep. The light lowered and pulled a soft gold down the glass. They did not light the electric lamps even though power had returned. They lit one candle and set it in a cup where the glass would be kind to the flame, and they sat on the bench by the door to watch the town turn toward evening. The clock tower ring could not be seen from there, but they both felt it as if a circle of warm air were held above the square. They spoke once more about the travelers who had found their way last night, and they pictured the moment when the couple had looked up and seen the jars lit like patient stars and had felt a little less alone. They fell quiet and let that picture stay as a companion. Later they walked down the hill and paused outside the cafe window to see the market lantern on the shelf. The owner had not yet lit it because the sun had not fully left, but the glass in the frame held the last light like water in a pail, and it was enough. They stood for a minute and then kept walking. At the corner where they often parted, they faced each other and spoke about the way the day had felt full without asking for any proof of accomplishment. Only steady looking and gentle choices. He told her that the market had reminded him that craft is a form of kindness offered to strangers. She told him that choosing the lantern together had felt like choosing a small room for their days to visit whenever the world grew sharp. They agreed to meet in the morning to set the first hooks in the frame and to bring the lantern closer to finished, and she promised to bring the list of safe methods and a cloth to hold the pieces as if they were cups of warm tea, and he promised to sand one edge he had noticed still felt a little rough. They said good night in low voices that matched the hour. When Aiden reached his room, he set his tin of new tea on the table and opened the lid to breathe in the fragrance that carried both earth and light. He set the sketchbook down and lifted the small glass of the cutting and held it near the window so the root could feel the cooler air. He wrote a single line on a card and set it by the glass. It read "Light found together," and after he wrote it he did not add more, because adding more would have been like speaking over a friend who has given the right answer. He washed his cup and listened to the slow rhythm of waves below the hill. And then he lay down and let sleep move toward him at the same gentle pace the market had moved, steady and sure, hands out, ready to carry him across to a place where the day could be folded like a cloth and set on a shelf, still warm and full